At 14, my parents left me at my grandmother's house, labeling me a freak because of my medical issues. Now, they're pleading for my inheritance to help my brother out of his troubles. When I was young, I was diagnosed with epilepsy, which my parents were ill-equipped to handle emotionally or mentally. Instead of providing support, they treated me like a burden. I was around 6 when I began to notice the disparity in how they treated my brother and me. He was 3 years older and, being easier to manage, was favored significantly, as if epilepsy weren't enough of a challenge. I was also diagnosed with dyslexia and severe ADHD at 8. My parents were overwhelmed by my needs. If they had been kind and accepting, it might have been different. Parenting a child with special needs isn't easy, but they chose to have me. They seemed to expect that since my brother was perfectly healthy, I would be too. When reality didn't align with their expectations, they acted as if they were reluctantly tolerating me. My childhood wasn't typical, not just because of my conditions, but also due to my parents' behavior. Much of my misery stemmed from their treatment. I often felt like an outcast in my own family, an unwanted burden. They walked on eggshells around me, and conversations would stop when I entered a room, as if my presence sucked the life out of it. This treatment began when I was very young, and it only worsened as I grew older, leaving my mental health in tatters. As a teenager, I began to act out. Hormones and a deep-seated misery from feeling unwanted pushed me to rebel. I stopped caring about school and intentionally flunked my classes. Fueled by anger at my parents, I became defiant and rude, pushing everyone away, including my friends. I knew this behavior was harmful, but I felt desperate for my parents' attention. Even that didn't prompt a response. Whenever the school called about my behavior, my parents sighed in disappointment, showing no interest in reprimanding me. Their indifference was infuriating, and I grew to despise being around them. I would throw tantrums, trying to draw their attention, only to be met with their dismissive chatter as they ignored me. They would roll their eyes and tell me to be normal, which was the closest I got to any acknowledgement from them. It was heartbreaking. At 14, I crossed a major line at school when I brought a pack of cigarettes and lit upright in class. When my teacher caught me and demanded I stop, I flipped him off. That moment marked a turning point. I had already been a troublemaker, but my parents had always excused my behavior, claiming I wasn't normal and that I had special needs. However, after this incident, there was no turning back. I got expelled, and for the first time, my parents were genuinely furious. They unleashed a torrent of harsh words that I doubt I'll ever forget. They didn't tell me anything I didn't already know, but hearing it spoken aloud was devastating. They expressed regret for having me, saying that if they had known I would turn out to be such a psychotic little kid, they would have terminated the pregnancy. They called me a burden on the family, saying they were better off with just my brother. To drive the point home, they declared that I would leave the family and never come back. I was grounded for a week, and during that time, they locked me in my room, allowing only bathroom breaks. Even my meals were sent up to me. I wasn't allowed to go anywhere or speak to anyone, and I felt utterly miserable. It was like being a prisoner in solitary confinement, but worse because it was my own parents who were doing this to me. I hadn't committed a crime. I was simply acting out. I believed a lot of my struggles stemmed from their lack of attention. As a child, I needed better parenting. I knew I wasn't the easiest kid to handle with my illnesses, but they should have factored that into their decisions before having me. After a week of this treatment, I discovered the true meaning of their threat to cut me off from the family. One day, they ordered me to get into the car with all my belongings. My brother and mom packed my things while I waited anxiously in the car. When we hit the road, I recognized the route. We were heading to my grandmother's house, my dad's mom. I thought maybe I'd be staying there for a couple of weeks to collect myself. My grandma was strict but kind and had always treated me better than my parents. However, when we arrived, I realized this wasn't a temporary arrangement. They were abandoning me with my grandmother to raise me because they had given up. That week had been spent convincing her to take me in. As soon as we reached her house, my parents unloaded my things and told me to bring them inside. They informed me that this was my new home and that they wanted no further contact with me, especially after my recent antics. They claimed I was trying to ruin their reputation, and I had crossed a line that could never be undone. Desperate, I begged them not to do this. Despite everything, I still craved a relationship with them. I was just 14 and yearning for a sense of belonging. It was heartbreaking to leave them behind. I was also worried about whether my grandmother could care for me, as she was already in her 60s. I knew she loved me, but I wasn't sure if she truly wanted to take me in. I feared I was merely shifting from being a burden to my parents to becoming one for my grandmother. I didn't want to disappoint my grandmother. Whenever I visited her and she learned about my troubles at home and school, her disappointment was palpable, but she always encouraged me, reminding me that I was made of stronger stuff. She believed my parents would eventually come around if I just behaved better. That made me even more reluctant to move in with her. I feared she might start resenting me, just like my parents had. Losing her too was not something I could bear. Desperate to stay with my parents, I begged them to reconsider, but they stood firm in their decision. In front of my grandmother, they declared they were done with me and didn't want to hear about me again. They insisted they didn't want a freak like me living with them anymore, wanting to focus on my perfectly normal brother. Hearing them use such cruel language cut deep. It was one thing to be bullied at school. I was used to that, but when my own parents called me a freak, I realized they were the biggest bullies in my life. In a way, they were doing me a favor by sending me to live with my grandma, because they had never truly loved me. I suspected that even if I had changed my behavior, it wouldn't have mattered to them. To them, my brother was their only child. From that moment on, I stopped begging and accepted my new reality. I resolved to be better, not just for myself, but for my grandmother, too. I wouldn't throw my life away just because my parents didn't care. Once they left, my grandmother and I sat down for an important conversation. She was honest with me. Although she loved me, she hadn't been prepared to take me in. She had concerns about my behavior, which my father had shared with her. At her age, she worried that handling a troubled kid like me would be too much. She understood I needed help but wasn't sure if she could provide the right environment for me to grow. She explained that it took her a week to decide whether to take me in because she wanted to be sure she was making the right choice. After hearing about how I had been grounded and confined to my room, she realized that my father wasn't the right person to raise me. She apologized for not intervening sooner, admitting that she had her own worries to consider as a widow with limited resources. However, after learning how badly I had been treated, she wanted to offer me a fresh start. Unlike my parents, she was determined to do right by me. I took her words to heart and apologized for my past actions, also forgiving her for not stepping in earlier. Together, we decided to put the past behind us and work toward a better future. I will always be grateful to my grandmother for everything she did for me. I genuinely believe I wouldn't be who I am today without her support and love. After moving in with her, I made a conscious effort to improve in all areas of my life. My grandmother did everything she could to support me, providing the nurturing environment I needed to thrive. She arranged for tutors to help with my academics and even enrolled me in a private school. She made sure everyone understood my needs, so I wouldn't be treated like just another student. Unlike my parents, she didn't use my challenges as an excuse. She used them as a reason to offer the help I so desperately needed. With her support, I turned my life around, graduated with good grades, and went on to college like any other kid. I accomplished everything I set out to do, and for that, I owe my grandmother everything. My parents continued to visit my grandmother from time to time, but they never made an effort to see me. I made it a point to stay out of their way. Each time they came over, I would leave the house and only return after I was certain they had left. They seemed indifferent to my absence, and honestly, so did I. This routine continued for a couple of years until my grandmother confronted them during one of their visits. She expressed her outrage at their refusal to even attempt to talk to me, especially given that I was doing better and they had ample reason to apologize for their past behavior. Instead of taking responsibility, they insisted they were perfect parents and dismissed me as a rotten apple and a freak once again. That was the breaking point for my grandma. She told them never to return. Their egos blinded them to the fact that their poor parenting had contributed to my struggles at 14. Thanks to my grandmother's guidance, I had turned my life around, but they failed to see that. After that confrontation, communication was severed. For nearly 10 years, my grandma and I pretended my parents didn't exist. During that time, I achieved so much and hit various milestones, all while maintaining a silence with my parents. They never reached out. Despite my active social media presence, I left them unblocked. They just chose not to connect. Recently, however, they contacted me, but only after my grandmother passed away a few months ago. Her loss hit me hard. She was my only true supporter, my rock. Even after I moved out for college and then settled into my own place, she remained my unwavering support system. Adjusting to life without her was challenging, and I was still grieving when my parents showed up at my door. Not even 6 months had passed since her death, and they were already demanding I share my inheritance with them. Apparently, my once typical brother was not faring well and had developed a drug habit while in college, which was now impacting his ability to work. They came to me asking for help to clean up the mess he had made. I was surprised to see them without my brother, as he had always accompanied them on previous visits. Thinking they were finally here to apologize, I engaged in small talk and offered my condolences. However, they quickly cut to the chase. They informed me that my brother needed help, and they wanted me to share my inheritance to pay for a residential rehab program because they claimed the lower-cost options weren't suitable for him. Their attempt to downplay the severity of the situation didn't sit right with me. From what I gathered, he was in serious trouble. I asked why he couldn't simply attend a more affordable program, but they insisted that those weren't good enough for him. They explained they had tried, but he needed something more comprehensive, which, of course, came with a hefty price tag. Honestly, I didn't know much about rehab costs, nor did I feel inclined to research it. I had a stable job and was comfortable financially. I knew my grandmother had also been well off, having inherited a significant amount from my grandfather, which she had wisely invested. Despite this, my parents were too proud to keep in touch with her or apologize in her final days, fully aware they might one day need her money. I didn't feel any remorse when I told my parents that I was willing to help them financially, but there was one condition: they needed to publicly acknowledge everything they had done in the past. I wanted them to admit the terrible way they treated me, the hurtful things they said, and their unkindness toward my grandmother. It was crucial to me that they recognized their need for my help and the reasons they were asking for my inheritance. For years, we had kept our issues private because my grandmother wanted to avoid drama, but now they had the audacity to ask for my support, asking me to share my grandmother's money despite how they had treated us over the last decade. I felt this acknowledgement was necessary. I didn't hesitate to demand this from them. They needed to confront their wrongdoings publicly. When I expressed this condition, their faces fell. They attempted to negotiate, calling me unreasonable and selfish, but I stood my ground. I was open to providing them with the money they needed, and I had no resentment toward my brother anymore. However, they needed to recognize their mistakes before I could fully move on from our past. They had treated me poorly, and there was no denying that. They were also unkind to my grandmother, and this was her money we were discussing. If they wanted it, they had to face the truth. Their reaction was baffling. They started labeling me as heartless and emotionless, claiming they never expected this behavior from me. I reminded them that they had no right to expect anything from me after a decade of silence. If they wanted my help, they would need to acknowledge and apologize for their past mistakes, and that was non-negotiable. After a lengthy exchange filled with tears and accusations, they left, but I remained resolute. Now, they're trying to sway me by insisting that my brother is in dire straits and needs my assistance, but I don't understand why they expect me to help them when I never expected anything from them. My grandmother and I only had each other. They never bothered to check in on us. When she passed away, I doubt they would have known had I not informed my relatives, which is how they found out about the funeral. So why should I assist people who had no part in my life for the last decade? I just want to ensure I'm not being unreasonable for insisting my parents publicly acknowledge their mistakes before I offer them any financial help. Update 1. Thank you all for your comments on my original post. I appreciate your concern. I'm doing well despite the loss of my grandmother. It's been tough, but she lived a full life and left without regrets. I'm grateful for that. As for my parents, they continue to bombard me online. I've made it clear that if they don't meet my condition, they can forget about inheriting any money. I'm aware my grandmother left everything to me in her will, and I believe my parents are also aware, as the lawyer sent out an email regarding it. Now, all they can do is sit with their regret. It's been a week since I last spoke to them, and since their pleas haven't swayed me, they've resorted to sending me pictures of my brother. He looks terrible, his condition is disheartening, and they keep sending me these images, insisting this is the person who needs my help. My response to that is simple: where were they when I needed assistance? They abandoned me, and I was fortunate my grandmother had my back. Otherwise, I shudder to think where I'd be. They didn't care about me, and while I do feel sympathy for my brother, I can't help them unless they apologize publicly for their actions. I want everyone to know the truth about who they are. If they can put the IR pride aside for this, I'm willing to help. It's about breaking their pride, which is what led them to mistreat me in the first place. I want to see what matters more to them, my brother's well-being or their pride. Update 2. 10 days have passed since my last interaction with my parents. Eventually, I stopped responding to their messages, which led them to show up at my place a few hours ago, this time bringing my brother with them. It was bad. At the door, I told them they couldn't do this, that their actions were only harming their chances of receiving anything from me. I wasn't comfortable with their tactics, not even toward my brother. I could only imagine how degrading it felt for him to be used like this. I told them to leave, but they initially refused, insisting I promised to help if I wanted them to go. I stood firm, saying I wouldn't make any promises, and warned them I would call the police if they continued to push me. That seemed to scare them. Given my brother's state, they eventually left, but not without my dad accusing both me and my grandmother of being the most selfish people on the planet. It's quite ironic, considering they dumped me on her doorstep just because they didn't want to deal with a child with SPICY-AL needs. They wanted the perfect son, and if they think my grandmother and I are selfish, then there are truly no words for what they are. Update 3. Hi everyone. I kind of forgot to update because I got really busy with work. It's been almost 2 months since my last post, and a lot has changed. For one, I've blocked my parents and cut off all contact. I moved into a better apartment in a new neighborhood, and they have no way of finding me. I've also made it clear to my relatives not to share my address with anyone, especially my parents. The last time someone decided my parents deserved to know where I lived because their son was suffering, it led to them contacting me again. I won't let that happen again. After my last conversation, when my dad called me selfish, I chose to block them to avoid further drama. They have shown me that, for them, their pride will always come first, above everything else, including their son, whom they claim to love. I accept that they never loved or wanted me because of my dyslexia, ADHD, and all the challenges I faced. While my brother was their ideal child, it's beyond me how they couldn't make one small sacrifice for him. All they had to do was acknowledge their mistakes, which wouldn't have been difficult since most of our family already knew about the rift between us. They weren't admitting to something unknown. Yet, their unwillingness to apologize stems from their belief that they did nothing wrong and are perfect parents. They can keep that delusion to themselves while I retain my inheritance. That seems fair enough.